Hello, I'm Brian Johnson from Masterpiece Archery Targets and Revolution Taxidermy Supply. What I'm talking about today is perfect shot placement. Perfect shot placement is based upon our system of 3 separate principles. I'm building this kind of like a pyramid, and on the top of the pyramid is our 4 separate shooting systems. The 4 separate shooting systems are built on what we call center kill technology. Center kill technology is based upon perfect anatomy. So we're basing pinpoint perfect shot placement on these 3 principles. Today specifically, I'm talking on perfect anatomy. Now this particular deer you see in front of me is the ultimate anatomy organ buck. I took about a year off my sculpturing schedule to sculpture this deer. This has individual organs and skeletal parts that actually come apart from the sculpture that you can actually hold in your hand. I've taken this deer with my research of the actual lungs and liver and everything that I've studied for almost going on 40 years to anatomy professors from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the University of Minnesota. These are veterinary anatomy professors because the information that I found on anatomy that's out there in the hunting world, in the veterinary world, is completely different than what I personally found out from studying the animal. So these things that I'm going to show you, I believe have been reviewed by people that are experts. It's the research that I've done myself, and I believe there's nothing in the world that's even in the ballpark anatomically as perfect as this. I try to do the absolute best. One of my lifelong goals was to make a deer with absolutely perfect anatomy. Now, I'm going to go over to the front, and I'm going to talk about starting from the head, coming down and going to the back. And I'm going to try to relate everything here, how it relates to hunters and how it relates specifically to archers. This particular deer was a 2.5-year-old Montana 8-point that I shot, I believe, about 2-3 years ago. So we're going to go over here and we're going to start with the head. The first thing I want you to notice in the head is we've actually reproduced the brain and the size of the brain. Now, you have a lot of people that take headshots. I want to tell you I'm 100% against headshots, and here's why. You have a very small amount in the brain. If you take a look at the size of the brain, what a small amount that is in proportion to the whole head. So when you're shooting him in the head, if you hit him in any other place besides the brain, you're very likely to be able to cripple the animal. And what we're wanting to do, my whole shooting system is based upon the principle or the goal of shooting a deer that's dead within 10 seconds and travels no more than 150 yards. And headshots are very risky, and I've heard terrible stories of deer that are crippled from being shot in the head. So do not take those. And that's why we sculptured this, so you can see how small the brain really is. Now as we come on down here, there's some things that I want you to pay particular attention to. First, right here, you'll see this bulge of this muscle here. This muscle is cut away so we can review the trachea and the esophagus. This muscle is the sternal-maxillary muscle. That's when you see a buck that's in the rut, especially down south and they have fine fur, their chest muscles are like breast muscles, stand out. They actually have cleavage in the front here. Those 2 muscles are the sternal-maxillaries. On the inside of the sternal-maxillary right here, there is a vein, there's a groove between that muscle and the big muscle that's on the side, which is called the mastoidal humerus. That groove is called the jugular groove, and sits in there is the jugular vein and the carotid artery, and they come up from the bottom here from the heart and they go up along the bottom of the neck. If a person shoots a deer in the neck, you'll notice that, oh, I shot him in the neck, and I shoot him in the neck and they die right away. Well, if you happen to hit a major blood vessel in the neck, they can die right away. But there's a lot of tissue here, and especially the bigger buck, when their necks get bigger, you have a very small target. So again, I don't recommend at all shooting them in the neck. With a rifle, traditionally, the way I grew up, people shot them in the neck because they dropped there, they didn't run to the neighbor's property, but that's a whole different ball game, hitting the whole backbone structure with shock and in a rifle. That's completely different than with an arrow. So now I want you to see as we come down here, you'll see we have the trachea and the esophagus. That sits on the outside of the neck. As the neck muscles bulge, it comes on the inside because it doesn't pull out there with them. Okay, and the esophagus, the trachea, of course, is what we call our breathing tube, which goes to the lungs. The esophagus is the feeding tube, which goes down into the stomach. Now, on the back of the neck right here, you'll see like a cord that's attached. It's actually like a rope. I actually have webbing that's attached here, and that's sculptured in to show you that this here is called the cervical ligament. And it is, when I say designed, God designed it, but it is designed that actually attaches the head to all the vertebrae going along the back. And to me, it's like a giant yellow rubber band which holds everything together. And it actually bifurcates or separates down into two pieces, actually here at the shoulder. Now, as you come down, I want you to see these vertebrae. Each one of these vertebrae has been reproduced or cast or molded exactly off the carcass from my deer. Everything we did on here, we did to try to reproduce, I mean down to the minutest detail, as perfect as we can. So the things that we want to note here is this. There's 7 cervical vertebrae. They use the word cervical, we just use the word neck. So there's 7 neck vertebrae as we come down. Now, the first one here is the wing of the atlas. You'll see in a taxidermy mount, and I'm a taxidermy sculptor, is you'll see a bulge right below the ears. And there's a muscle, or there's a bone here which protrudes outward, the muscles bulge on it, and that's called the wing of the atlas. And that's an anatomical feature that I put in my taxidermy sculptures. The next one down here is the axis, and you see on the top of the bone here, see how this is almost at an angle, well, it's not level, but you see how it's joined completely different? That's the axis vertebrae. The second one, that's the main one where the head pivots side to side, and that's right there. Now, as you come down here, what I want you to notice here anatomically on my sculpture, different than almost any other drawings anatomically you'll find of white-tailed deer, is that the vertebrae come down low in the neck. You'll see most people believe that I've talked to, and most of the drawings have the neck vertebrae all the way up here along the top. Now, one of the reasons that that's not true, and one of the anatomical features that's quite important, is right here. This is the 6th cervical vertebrae. This is the 7th. This is the last one. From 7 here, we start 1, and 1 is where we're starting with the thoracic vertebrae. But if you look at the very bottom here, there's a keel there. That vertebrae actually comes down and has, I call it a keel. It's kind of like a upside down U shape, and in the middle of that sits the trachea and the esophagus. They go right inside that. It's made perfect for that to fit right in there like this. The drawings that have the vertebrae up higher, they have to separate the trachea and the esophagus from this groove, and it's anatomically wrong, and that's one way that I can prove it to them, because the trachea and esophagus sit in the cervical, the 6th cervical, the keel, and it cannot be up high there because it has to come into the beginning of the lungs down here. Okay? Now, if you take a look at these veins here, coming right out of the front here where our trachea and esophagus is, this is the bronchiocephalic trunk. And the reason this has importance to you as a hunter is if you ever did take a front-on shot, because I'm very big in my anatomy of showing you the room that you have to take a quartering on shot in here like this. There's very, very, very little room for that shot. But what comes out in this small little area, it's a very small area, but it's a bread and butter issue where there's a tremendous amount of, it's kind of the junction where everything happens. Everything comes out of the heart that goes forward through the bronchiocephalic trunk, and from there it goes down to the legs, and everything goes up to the head. So if an arrow does get in there, it's extremely deadly, but it's very small. And my principle of everything I'm teaching is based upon shooting the deer in the largest area possible, so even if you miss the spot you're aiming at, you'll still kill the deer. So this is a low odd shot. In fact, I had an elk at 11 yards, I was at full draw for a number of seconds. It seemed like a minute, and my pin's right on his chest. And even though I study all this anatomy, I didn't shoot. One reason is the anatomy of an elk with all his like beard hanging down in the fur there, I could not see where all that anatomy was. So I passed on that shot. But now, the next thing we want to note, which is very important, do you see this bone here? That's the first rib. Now, we actually took the first rib and we actually molded it. And you think, why in the world would a guy spend all the money to mold one lousy rib, and especially a small one at that? And the reason I did it is, again, to show you how short, how small that area is. The lungs in the front fit inside the rib cage. Anything inside the rib cage is called the thoracic cavity. In the front of the thoracic cavity, in the very front, is where this last rib is. So the lungs are only as tall in the very front as from the bottom of this rib to the top of this rib, and they're very thin. In the back, they can be almost 10 inches thick. In the front, I can only get between the two ribs on both sides, I can only get about 2.5 fingers when I push my fingers in between them. It's very, very narrow. So in other words, if you wanted to make a front-on shot like this, to be able to go through the middle, to go through both ribs, you only have this much width for your arrow to go through, okay? And you only have the height from the bottom of the rib to the top of the rib. So you're literally talking a section about that big. Very, very small to make a perfect shot. You do have, however, more room if you're taking, instead of a front-on shot, a quartering shot there that you can get inside this bone and in at an angle here like this. So, now, as we go back, I want you to see these shoulder bones. The shoulder bones is comprised of two separate bones, and they're not, on the top, they're not attached to any other bone. You think of most bones are attached to everything. These are not. The humerus bone here, this is attached to the rest of the leg going down. This top part, this is the scapula, referred to as the shoulder blade, that floats, and that's attached to the rest of the body totally by muscle and ligaments. So in this move, so depending when you shoot the deer, where his leg, where the motion is, will determine where those bones are at. Now, on the bottom edge of what we would call his elbow, it's called the ocrine. That sits below the bottom of the heart. So it's pretty hard if you're hunting in a tree that the ocrine is not in the way from actually hitting the heart. Okay? Now, the shoulder blade here, I've actually sculptured, this is my own opinion, but I put what I call the penetrating triangle. Even though we don't want to shoot this, you'll see people that'll shoot the deer in the shoulder blade and they'll say, man, I got a good broadhead, went right through the shoulder blade. Well, this little triangle here, which I've got marked on the shoulder blade, is quite thin. And if you use a fixed blade broadhead or a small broadhead, depending on the poundage of your bow, you can go through this part pretty easy. And if you're up high in a tree, you can go down into the lungs and you can kill a deer quite easily. In fact, my daughter did it with a 45-pound bow with a 3-blade Muzzy broadhead. She shot her in the shoulder blade. Most of the arrow was sticking out. It ran away. I was hunting by her. I saw it. I was sick. The deer went 100 yards because it went through, hit both lungs, and the deer was dead. Now, if you go down here, this edge, there's a rib on the edge of the shoulder blade or scapula. If you hit this, it's a whole different story. If you go forward, this rib here is called the spine of the scapula. You hit this, you're going to have a super powerful bow and a super powerful broadhead to go through this here. Then the other main thing that I want you to notice is the difference between the shoulder ball here. That's what it's referred to commonly as the shoulder ball. The farthest part out here that you see in a deer, if you actually go up to them and you rub a deer, you rub your dog, this here is called the external or the outside tuberosity, just describes the shape of the humerus. That's the farthest out. So if you take that measurement there to the inside, you still have got a good 3 fingers that you can fit an arrow in from that angle to hit there. And again, I do not recommend that shot, but I know people are going to take the shot, and the more knowledge they have of where that angle is, the better they will be at least making a correct shot. Another thing I want you to see is how low in the animal this is. Many people, when they take a front-on shot, especially if you're up in a tree, they're going to bring the arrow in and they're going to end up hitting the backbone right here. They're going to hit the neck vertebrae. Actually, you have to shoot quite low to get this. And if you're up in a tree, to be able to shoot down here and to get through there, you have even a smaller opportunity. Had I known on an elk, the anatomy of the elk, because the fur was there, I had a simple, easy 11-yard shot. He stood there for quite a while. I'm at full draw. I even centered my peep twice, but his beard was hanging there, and I wasn't sure, and I hesitated, and I didn't shoot. I'm glad I didn't. So, now, if you notice the shape here from the humerus going to the scapula, it forms what I call the magic triangle. So if you can get your arrow anywhere in this magic triangle going forward, it is a fantastic shot. The reason it's a fantastic shot is the closer you get to the pump, in other words, I call the heart, from like a plumbing perspective, a pump, where all the valves, all the plumbing systems comes and goes from the major pump. The heart has all the arteries and veins coming and going there, and the closer you get, the better the odds that you have of actually hitting one of those and hitting one of the pipes, and the deer is going to bleed to death very fast. The problem is, if you shoot low here, you can hit this humerus bone, which I've done before. If you hit high, you can hit the scapula. So what we do is we'll go back here a little bit, and we'll go backwards. Actually, we should go down first. We'll take a look at the heart. The heart, actually, I have reliefed here so you can see it, but the heart actually is covered by lungs. So it's basically impossible to shoot a deer in the heart without hitting the lungs, because the lungs envelop and cover over where the heart is. I cut this out here just so you could see specifically where the heart is. Now, as you go back farther, I want you to see a couple of things on my lungs compared to what you're going to see in the drawings. Number one is you'll see how big they are in the back. Because remember, what we're going to go to later is our perfect shot placement has to do where is the perfect spot to aim at this deer to be able to kill it. Where's the spot that gives us the biggest kill area? That's 2 videos from now, but I'm wanting you to try to remember this. The rear end of the lungs goes back to the 12th thoracic vertebrae. Remember, they have 13 ribs and they're attached to the vertebrae in the top. The lungs fill up the whole thoracic cavity. But the diaphragm is attached to the ribs and shaped in such a way, concave, convex, that I found in my research that when we actually inflate the lungs back to natural size, I go to the 12th vertebrae right here, and the lungs come perfectly straight down, perfectly plumb down, and then they swing forward. You will notice on most or many anatomical drawing of lungs that they'll start here and they'll actually have a half moon shape going forward. The reason they do that, I believe, is the lungs are convex here, on the inside they're concave, and the diaphragm follows that shape. So I'm imagining that when they x-ray the lungs, they'll see the diaphragm and they'll assume that, oh, that's the lungs, but that's the inside shape of the lungs. So that's different than what we see here on the outside shape of the lungs. Now, right underneath, or on top of the lungs, you'll see this cord looking here in the back there. This is actually the thoracic aorta, the major blood vessel that comes out of the heart. It goes up, it attaches to the bottom of the backbone, it goes all the way to the back legs where it spreads out and hits the femoral artery and goes down the bottom of the legs. Now, what I want you to see here is if I hold this arrow level and I come in there, my arrow is actually going above this vertebrae, or going above the aorta. Most people are going to tell you, I shouldn't say most, many people in the archery industry believe that the lungs, my lungs here especially, are too tall because they believe there should be a dead spot on top of the lungs and below the backbone where a broadhead can get through. That is a complete wives' tales. And I like challenging people to believe that, because the more they say that, the more it helps me explain to them perfect anatomy. We just came back from the 2015 archery trade show in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I had an actual deer there, that was a roadkill, and I actually inflated the lungs, and I actually showed where this took place. I first found this out by Terry Amundsen, who was the wildlife disease specialist for the state of Wisconsin. And after he told me that, and I was under the misconception that that gap was there, the dead zone, I shot a deer where I actually hit the lung. I was in a tree, I hit the lung going in here, and I clipped the artery on the top of the backbone. Since then, I shot another deer like that, and my son shot one a year ago where he hit both the lung on the high side going in, and as the arrow went down, he actually cut the aorta, and I have the photographs of that. So I know there's going to be many of you see this and you're still not going to believe it, but we're going to have some other videos of me inflating lungs that you'll be able to see, that will be able to prove it. And you talk to anybody that's a veterinarian, that's in the anatomy field, they will tell you that the thorax cavity, which is the lung cavity, is totally filled up with lungs. There's no void space, because the lungs, the cavity itself, there's a vacuum between the outside of the lungs and the inside of the rib cage that has those lungs pulled tight. The movement of the lungs expanding is outward from muscles that are on the ribs, and it's backwards from the diaphragm that moves back and forth. The liver, as we go back, there can be some movement in the liver because the liver sits outside the diaphragm, which is here. And depending on if the more food the animal is eating can push the liver forward, because I feel that the liver is kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, because the stomach, as it gets bulged, pushes the liver forward. The lungs, as they inflate, push the liver backwards. In the movement, the liver is kind of caught in the middle. In fact, you'll see some deer where their stomachs hang down. You'll see some deers where their stomach where it goes back up. The liver is attached to the diaphragm and it floats. Now, as you see here, the liver goes from the back, from the outside. It's on the outside of the rib cage, but the rib cage is concave, convex. So the liver, even though it's on the outside, sits on the inside when you look at it from a cross-sectional view. And so the back of the liver has what they call the caudate liver lobe, and that sits right up where the kidneys are. And the one kidney sits on the right side, the other kidney does not oppose it on the other side. It seems to be, from my observation, more in the middle of the backbone and back farther. So when we go back here, everything to do with the intestines and the stomach, this is all what we just call guts. And in reality, the intestines fill the whole right side of this cavity. The reason I put in these different arteries in the stomach here is just to show the different anatomy. Now in the liver goes forward at this angle like this, following the diaphragm, and I've noticed some livers do not go all the way down to the belly. They start in the back high and they go down 3/4 of the way. I've seen other ones that are so big, and I suppose just like humans, some have big hearts, or different parts vary. I've seen some where I can barely fit it back in the cavity, it's so big. But as a general rule, it always is attached up high, it angles forward and comes down. So those are the basic parts that I wanted to talk to you about, except for with one exception. I want you to see the people that hit the deer high. They go through here and they think they hit the dead zone, where actually they're coming in and going down right through here. They're going through the top of these vertebrae. The top of the scapula here is actually cartilage. This is not bone, this section. So you can easily go through that. And so that's actually what's happening, is when people shoot through, which they believe they got above the lungs, is they're actually shooting above the lungs, or they're shooting forward where the backbone goes down low. So I know that's a lot of information. I know many of you are not going to want to spend the time to watch all this. Those of you that are like me that are really into this, you'll rewind it and watch it a few times. But the major principle is I'm trying to lay the foundation for making a pinpoint perfect shot. And I can't tell you where that is without giving you the basis of the proper anatomy. From here, the next video we're going to make is called Center Kill Technology, and that's going to take the next step of showing where the exact spot is. There's a perfect spot the size of a quarter, the size of a dime, where you want to hit the deer every time, and we're going to explain that, and that's called Center Kill Technology. And then after you understand that, we're then going to go back and show you our 4 different shooting systems that tells you how on the outside of the deer to be able to hit that spot. So to sum up this video, for pinpoint perfect shot placement, it's based upon 3 principles. Number 1, perfect anatomy. This is a pyramid. The next step is going to be center kill technology. And then the third one, the final one, is our 4 different shooting systems that tells you exactly where to shoot the deer on the outside, so you'll be shooting the absolute biggest target possible, so the deer dies as quick as possible. That's what this is all about, to put more venison in your freezer, less food for the coyotes, and no crippled deer.